The corporate media has been using the Goldwater Rule to sidestep serious conversations about mental health. Today, we're putting the Goldwater Rule on the couch. I'm Dr. Marlene Ryle. I'm a psychologist and a psychiatric nurse practitioner with 30 years of experience in the field. And you're watching The World on the Couch, where we put the news cycle through a psychological lens, because that's the part the news almost always misses. You've probably heard the Goldwater Rule invoked as the reason why mental health professionals haven't been weighing in on what we've all been seeing and sitting with in the last decade of American political life. Let's talk about what it is. It's a guideline. It's Section 7.3 of the American Psychiatric Association's Principles of Medical Ethics, adopted in 1973. Let me read to you from what the rule says. On occasion, psychiatrists are asked for an opinion about an individual who is in the light of public attention or who has disclosed information about himself or herself through public media. In such circumstances, a psychiatrist may share with the public his or her expertise about psychiatric issues in general. However, it is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement. This applies to members of the American Psychiatric Association, and I'm not one of them. As a psychiatric nurse practitioner, psychologist, person with postdoc training in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, I'm governed by different professional bodies, neither of which has an equivalent rule. What this show is doing is structural formulation, grounded in psychoanalytic psychotherapy and other psychological principles, and it's informed by decades of clinical experience. I'm not working around a constraint. The constraint doesn't apply to me. And what I'm doing by choice. I'm grounding every observation in publicly documented behaviors and established analytical frameworks. It's not because I have to do it. It's because I was trained to do, and I was trained to use intellectual and academic rigor. And frankly, it's the only intellectually honest way that I can have this conversation. Now, I wanted to bring up something else about the era of the Goldwater Rule. It was before social media, before the internet, before cable. I think we had like 4 channels. Yeah, 4. This was before a public figure could produce an unfiltered, unscripted, real-time record of their thoughts, their impulses, and their behaviors. And that record was available and is available to everyone now. In 1973, what you could know about a politician's psychology was largely whatever they chose to show you. And that world no longer exists. It wasn't just the media landscape that was different. The field itself was different. In 1973, the primary diagnostic tools in psychology were a clinical interview, some standardized assessments, and your clinical judgment. That was largely it. We didn't have neuroimaging, CT scans, brain scans, nothing showing us what these different pathologies looked like in a living brain. The psychopharmacological revolution was still in its infancy. Antipsychotic medication as we understand it today didn't yet exist. It did exist in the first generation, but they really didn't allow someone to be a productive individual. The diagnostic frameworks we now take for granted were decades away from their current form. And currently, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is in version 5 in a text revision. In 1973, they were working with the DSM-2, and there was a revolution between the DSM-2 and the DSM-3 in its taxonomy and nosology. But This is all to say that we know a lot more now than we knew then, and we have a lot more tools now than we did then. We also have years of unscripted moments, rally footage, press conferences, late night posts, a deeper, more comprehensive clinical record than what you'd get in a controlled interview that lasts an hour or two, where the subject knows they're being evaluated. The Goldwater Rule was written in an era where publicly available information was limited, and the science itself was in an earlier stage. The Goldwater Rule was written with a legitimate concern in mind, to prevent reckless, irresponsible public comments of political figures made by mental health professionals. Well, made by psychiatrists, because they were really one of the only two kind of mental health professionals there were. That's fair. What it produced as a cultural effect is something that its authors most certainly didn't anticipate nor intend. What it created was a virtual lockout of mental health professionals. There were brave voices, but nowhere near enough at that crucial moment when the public most needed people who knew how to read and interpret what we were all seeing for ourselves. And here's where I get a little less charitable. The media, and I mean all of it, from the ownership setting the editorial policy to the producers deciding what was and wasn't a story, to the anchors sitting at those desks every night, they all misread the Goldwater Rule or found it convenient to misread it. And a reason not to have a conversation that was genuinely uncomfortable, that didn't fit into a both sides frame. Now, the anchors themselves, I don't know how they felt about it. I'm not going to diagnose their interior life. But what I can tell you is what I observed. People out of their depth. In an institutional structure that provided them with a quasi-respectable way to stand aside. And it didn't require them to go any further. And talking about mental health makes people uncomfortable. It always has. There's nothing new about that. The rule just gave everyone on every level of that chain a plausible reason not to make themselves any more uncomfortable by pushing back. Unfortunately, this avoidance of the uncomfortable led to similar failures during the COVID pandemic. When people were isolated, when depression and anxiety were hitting historic highs and people were frightened and alone. They really needed some language for what was happening to them. It was vitally important and a very newsworthy moment to provide this basic psychoeducation. What isolation does to the brain, what depression looks like, how to recognize it, how to talk to someone you're worried about. Instead, we watched daily press conferences from someone who was more concerned with garnering attention for himself than with helping the American people who were confused, who were suffering, and who were dying. And not one person in that room during those daily briefings, not one, had the framework or apparently the permission to say out loud what they were looking at when someone told them to inject bleach. Now, I've been saying this for many years. I remember making this exact argument to someone whose son already had a national news desk covering all of it, put it that way. I said to him, someone with actual training needs to be in this conversation, not pundits performing armchair psychology. Those anchors and pundits were genuinely alarmed, as they should have been, as we all were. And they had to cover a leader with obvious psychopathologies without the clinical knowledge or framework or language to provide an even remotely adequate analysis. Now, there were those who paid attention and tried to educate themselves. George Conway stands out. He's running for Congress right now, and he's a constitutional attorney. Here's the problem. he got more airtime talking about the DSM criteria for antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder than any other mental health professional got. They didn't ask Hassan even to explain what those things were as a general thing. Think about that. Even if I studied a particular portion of the law, I would never be comparable to George Conway on matters of constitutional law. Yet he was provided generous amounts of airtime, as if he were an expert. And the public deserved and continues to deserve better than that. Time for the card. So I'm pulling a card from my original deck, the Aleister Crowley Thoth deck. And I normally don't use reversals in my own readings, but I'm going to use a reversed card here, and you'll see why. The card I've chosen is the Hierophant. Hold up my other hand. Now, this card, if you just look at it, it's so symbolically rich. If you go to, I think it's called esotericmeanings.com, this person does like videos on YouTube about each card that are very in-depth and very specific. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this upside down. Now, the Hierophant stands for, the teacher. It's number 5 in the deck, so it precedes the Lover's card. And in many decks, the Hierophant is actually presiding over the marriage that takes place in the Lover's card. And the card that it follows is number 4, the Emperor, which is, a lot of institutional authority, but this is sort of the upper and the lower. This is institutional authority. This is doctrine, religious doctrine, rules, a gatekeeper, if you will, of sanctioned knowledge. And this is the figure who says, this is how things are done. This is what's permitted. This is what you can say and what you can say. This is what you can do and not do. So in reverse, it's questioning that authority. It's questioning that orthodoxy because it's been revealed as outdated or self-serving. We just talked about the gatekeeper of sanctioned knowledge, and the Goldwater Rule is all about, only the APA is really the gatekeeper of the sanctioned knowledge. You have to get everything approved by them before you can say anything publicly about the mental health of a public figure. And it's also, the dogmatic approach to rules and hierarchy. It's the idea that you're not supposed to question these things. You're just supposed to obey them. So in the reverse, this is questioning and not obeying, because actually it hinders you from reaching your full potential. In this reverse reading, we're asking the gatekeeper to step aside. And this episode is literally about dismantling an institutional rule that has been used to gatekeep clinical analysis from public discourse. And, it's the problem here, obviously, is this has caused more problems than it's solved. And I feel like I'm sitting here as the rebel with credentials, not the rebel without a cause, but the rebel with credentials to question the authority of the American Psychiatric Association, to question why this rule was helpful, because it actually, what it has done is it has opened the gateway. It has only guarded one aspect of the gateway, but it let all these other people in to make these public comments about the mental health of a public figure who absolutely had no credentials and none of that knowledge. So what a waste. What a folly that this was. And it's really time to retire this rule. It was never forbidden territory, is what I'm saying. It was pretty much territory that was given up without much of a fight. And I want to reclaim and rectify some of that territory going forward. That's what the World on the Couch is really all about. Thank you for listening. I'm Dr. Marlene Ryle, and thank you for watching The World on the Couch.